Welcome, everybody. Good morning. My name is Jackie Riccio. I am the Executive Director of Cannabis for Conservation. We are a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to creating environmental conservation programs for the cannabis industry. And I am so excited to be here with all these phenomenal women today on this panel, Conservation Strategies for Cannabis Cultivators. And if you're not a cultivator, you're still going to hear lots of ways to engage with conservation from this conversation. So without further ado, I would love to just give short little 30-second intros to all the other women on this panel. Mary Jane, would you like to go first?
Hatsmeri Oikolo, Inawat Nitwas, Mary Jane Oatman. I'm joining everybody from the ancestral homelands of my people, the Nez Perce people. We're in the Columbia Basin here, specifically in Idaho.
Thank you, Mary Jane. Margaret, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Margaret Mantor. I work for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and specifically, I'm in the Cannabis Cultivation Permitting Program.
Thanks, Margaret. And that's Dr. Margaret Mantor. She doesn't like to introduce herself that way, but she does have a PhD. So, and last but certainly not least, Amanda, go ahead.
My name is Amanda Messler. I am the founder and president of Farms Inc., Oregon's cannabis farm advocates. I also chair the Josephine County Cannabis Advisory Panel, and I am the owner-operator of multiple cannabis farms in Oregon, Southern Oregon to be exact, Williams.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I don't know if I mentioned where I was, but I am up in Humboldt County, California, birthplace of kind of the entire cannabis industry. So huge welcome from Humboldt. Again, big honor to be here. And before we jump into the discussion, I'd like to just have a quick little conversation about why we're even here having this panel today. Conservation may not be something that people think of when they think of cannabis. It may not be something that comes to mind. Sustainability might be something more that comes to mind. But conservation has a very specific meaning. It means the sustainable use of a resource. And given that cannabis is a plant, it's an agricultural commodity, we have to be really conscious of the land that it's cultivated on. We have to be really conscious of how we are using resources. It's interesting because our culture, American culture, doesn't really leave a lot of space for conservation. We have a very kind of Descartes philosophy where humans are unnatural and humans can't possibly be part of the environment. And that's just simply not true. We clearly know that humans can make a positive impact on the environment from the oral traditions of our Indigenous peoples. We know that we are species that have evolved out of nature. We absolutely have a place, and it's just about learning how to manage and how to conserve and ensuring that we're being good stewards of our planet. When you understand your environment, when you know the types of plants out there, when you're stewarding them, when you know what they like, when you know the type of bird species that are in your yard, you feel connected to it. You have a different understanding of it, and you have a natural sense to want to conserve it, to have a responsibility to take care of your land. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. And Mary Jane, I'm gonna let you jump in here in a minute. I'd love to start with you and talk about the Indigenous perspectives on land management. And I just wanna kind of brief everybody with this idea of Indigenous perspectives. You don't have to be Indigenous to take an Indigenous perspective of stewardship, of trying to honor the land, of trying to steward it. And it's all about connection to place. When you understand your place, when you have place attachment, you want to protect it. And that's what we mean by Indigenous perspective. So without further ado, Mary Jane, please tell us about your rich cultural history with this plant. Tell us about Indigenous perspectives in cannabis.
Thank you so much to the hosts and for the warm welcome and introduction. I'm the founder of the Indigenous Cannabis Coalition. The Indigenous Cannabis Coalition, or ICANC, is a 501c3 that I started in May of 2019 to elevate the Indigenous voice in the cannabis space and to really foster more of an inclusive community that included Indigenous perspectives, traditional ecological knowledge, So it's really an honor and a privilege to be a part of this panel. And thank you to the fellow panelists for all of the work and the servant leadership that you all do for our sister plant. I definitely have a lot of work to do in Indigenous communities. It's kind of twofold. So the Indigenous Cannabis Coalition, we work specifically in tribal communities on education and advocacy for community. To build the support and to help end that negative stigma. And then externally, as you just mentioned, to broaden the scope of shared Indigenous perspectives in, I guess, responsibility of place. And so I really appreciate you bringing that up, because it is definitely something that we can all embrace, because we do have that shared responsibility, you know, just for humanity and for the next 7 generations to try to clean things up and leave it a little bit better than we found it. THC Magazine, as you see behind me on the side, is the work of the Indigenous Cannabis Coalition. So in February of 2020, we launched Tribal Hemp and Cannabis Magazine to elevate the Indigenous perspectives in print publication, and so that we could have stories of success to bridge tribal communities to the work that's being done, as well as to plant those seeds for the work that needs to be done, specifically in fiber cultivation, so that we can break away from the dependence on fossil fuel industries and to work on rematriation in our tribal communities of plant medicines. So it's been quite an honor to be able to, you know, do all of this work and just really preserve the story for the next, you know, for the future generations. And a part of that is important to me because, you know, we come from a very strong, in the Nez Perce community, and I'm a member of the Nez Perce tribe, a very strong, rich, and robust oral history and tradition. But a lot of that has been lost, you know, over the course of colonization. And so finding those little tidbits of knowledge that were preserved in oral tradition and history to be able to show that we've always been smoking people, to connect our spiritual pathways as smoking people to our peace pipes, which were very much a part of our treaty negotiations, you know, fast forwarding to 1855, which was when the treaty with the Nez Perce was created. And that was a very major contract for the United States government to negotiate with the principal people of the Columbia Plateau. And it was heavily bargained for and negotiated over sacred smoke. In those treaty councils, you know, our chiefs were denying the US government smoke to smoke our own blend of smoke. And, you know, in addition to that, they made it very verbal, and it's documented in our treaty council minutes that they wanted to counsel on these decisions with their wives. And so for them to bring that women's voice, that our women's voice mattered in the development of this new nationhood, I think was really, really poignant, you know, coming from a matriarchal society myself. And so it's been an honor to do this work in the preservation of stories to bridge tribal communities, because there's a lot of work being done for the I guess the preservation of Mother Earth in this space, because, you know, there's a lot of toxic Superfund sites that are on or near reservations, and we see a lot of light in the cultivation of hemp to clean up our homelands. It's really been an honor to be a part of the process of seeing the pendulum shift, you know, breaking away from a lot of the lucrative illicit businesses that were harming our homelands. And definitely, you know, our Hoopa and Yurok and Klamath brothers and sisters in Northern California experienced that with illegal grow operations in the diversion of our watersheds and the use of toxic insecticides. And so to be able to shape and form a responsible cannabis community during this time is really critical. That's why it's also important to leverage those relationships with tribes. The Environmental Protection Agency, Clean Water Act, Safe Water Drinking Act, some of these other areas within the EPA, they collaborate and coordinate with tribal agencies on the development of these rules and laws, and some of our tribes actually operate as a state in that regard, in the preservation of our homelands. And so some of the earlier operations that were done by the DEA for like Save Our Sierras and Full Court Operation Full Court Press and some of those kind of things that happen to really, take the stand and show, that the bad practices in the cannabis industry were not going to be allowed, really resonated, in tribal communities. And so we still, like I mentioned, have a long ways to go in ending a lot of that negative stigma. A lot of our tribal communities are still really hesitant in moving forward in the cannabis space just because of that long-standing negative history. That's why it's also really important to continue the telling of story in this space, because for our people, we have a very rich seed history that goes back prior to our Lewis and Clark contact. It goes back even further, in our oral traditions, as far as our acquisition of, the sacred smoking seed, and that presence in, the early 1800s in written documentation and history, proving that our people have always had that relationship. But we've got fractured relationships, and we all, I guess, have a lot of hope and promise, because we've seen it in our lifetime. But we still have that responsibility to lay the foundation, to do it in a more responsible way for Mother Earth, unlike what happened during the actual gold rush of the 1800s and the 1900s. We have technology, we have science, and, I think most importantly, what we see right now in gatherings such as the ones that we're all participating with the Cannabis Certification Council is a lot of compassion. And that's really what is needed to be able to shift the paradigm for our tribal, for all communities, but for our tribes as well.
Mary Jane, thank you so much. If I could ask one question, what is the best way for people to kind of engage with Indigenous perspective with connection to place? What would you say to them?
I think it's definitely exploring the homelands that you're on. When I mentioned, kind of that shared responsibility, for people around here on the Nez Perce homelands, it's about learning about, about the place and about the people that had aboriginally occupied the homelands. And I think also during a part of that journey, I think many of us realized that because we have been in a few centuries of this grand experiment, that we all have so many shared connections and relationships. And while we don't feel connected above ground, our roots, our blood ties to each other are very much ingrained in the soil.
Awesome. Yeah. And so that is an excellent first kind of conservation strategy. And that's something that no matter if you're a distributor, a retailer, a cultivator, whoever you are, an ancillary business in the cannabis space, you can engage in conservation in that way. So thank you so much, Mary Jane. We are taking questions throughout. This is a totally interactive panel. So if anyone has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and I can direct them to the correct panelists. So thank you, Mary Jane. We'll definitely come back to you and feel free to jump in whenever you feel necessary throughout the rest of the panel. So I'm going to transition now to Margaret, Dr. Margaret Mantor. And Margaret, why don't you just start off by telling us a little bit of how you first got into conservation to begin with?
Well, I guess I've always been interested in conservation all throughout school. And then I ended up going to grad school studying geography and actually specialized in biogeography, studying ground squirrels in California. After I got my PhD, my first job was with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I stayed there ever since. It's my first and only job. When I started with the department, I started out in the CISA program, which is the California Endangered Species Act. So my role was really developing protective measures for our listed species here in California. In 2018, when cannabis cultivation became legalized in California, it had a large impact on the Department of Fish and Wildlife. We suddenly had a very large role in permitting cultivation activities. We've always had a role in enforcement activities for cannabis cultivation before it was legalized. And now we're doing some other activities, such as not just with permitting, but we are doing studies, studying our watersheds to see how they're being impacted by cultivation, studying our terrestrial animals and seeing how they might be impacted by cultivation. So I'm largely in the permitting realm still. I've transferred over from the CISA program into the cannabis cultivation permitting program. And just to clarify, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, we don't actually permit any cultivation activities. We are responsible for protecting fish and wildlife here in California, for preserving them for everyone's enjoyment. So cultivation is licensed in California by 3 different agencies that are actually merging into one agency right now. Our role is anybody who wants to cultivate cannabis commercially in California. In order to get that license, they first need to come to the Department of Fish and Wildlife and get from us either a lake and stream bed alteration agreement or verification that they don't need one. So everybody who wants to get a license has to come to the department in some capacity and basically tell us about what their activities are going to be. If we feel that the activities are going to in some way impact a river, lake, or stream, then we start pursuing a lake and stream bed alteration agreement with that person. So it's cultivation. Cannabis cultivators aren't treated any differently than anybody else in California. Anybody who's going to be impacting a river, lake, and stream should be coming to us and getting that agreement. The big difference is it's required for licensing. So it really forces cannabis cultivators that they need to get that agreement or proof that they don't need to get one. So I'm definitely part of developing those agreements and the kind of protective measures that go into them. But what I really am passionate about and enjoy is doing outreach, both with cultivators and within CDFW, sort of making sure that we are able to connect with each other. We have had some negative feelings between cultivators and department staff. Largely, it's because we started out as the enforcers before cannabis became legalized. So we still have that sort of tension between cultivators and our enforcement staff. And to that end, like Jackie and I have been working a lot together on developing a program that's going to be hopefully bridging that gap and also really recognizing cultivators in California who are not just doing the right thing, but also going above and beyond what's required of them. They do have a lot of requirements in California, but we have cultivators who want to not just preserve habitat on their land, but create habitat. They want to create a space for our native fish and wildlife. So we are hoping to help them to do that and to also recognize them for their efforts. So, and Jackie, I think, is going to talk a bit more about that program.
Yeah, I was going to say, I would love to introduce it. So, and I have to say, Margaret is a superstar in the cannabis permitting department. We are super lucky to have her at CDFW. She's a total ally to the industry, and she works really, really hard to better relationships between cultivators and the industry. And I think that we've seen some really amazing headway made on that front because we have her in the permitting department. She treats people like they're humans, and she takes on a perspective of Instead of don't do this, it's, well, you could probably do this to help wildlife, and it's more of an education kind of standpoint. And I really appreciate that. I know the industry appreciates that. We do have a very, very long history of animosity between regulators and our legacy cultivators here in the North State of California. And, you know, it used to be the wild, wild west cannabis cowboys, and to some extent it still is. And anytime you have that trying to be regulated, there's a strong sense of independence and a strong sense of self-regulation within the industry. So there has been some headbutting, there has been some unfortunate animosity, but we are working to preserve that. And one of the ways that we are doing that is our next conservation strategy is through a certification called Wildlife Conscious. That is something that Margaret actually came up with from the beginning, and she rallied us all up. It's a huge collaboration between California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Cannabis for Conservation, Humboldt State University, International Cannabis Farmers Association, and cultivators like Swami Select. It's an amazing program. It's basically going to be the gold standard for conservation on cannabis farms. And it's all about creating habitat, enhancing habitat, preserving the habitat that's there, and also increasing connectivity between fragmented habitats. So it involves the use of things like bat and bird boxes, planting native plants, creating pollinator habitat, restoring different native plant species like oak trees. So there's lots of great information in there, and the program is designed to be educational. It's not designed to be regulatory really in any kind of way. We have workshops that we're going to do for how to maintain your properties, how to maintain your bat boxes. And it's all about just providing resources. A big part of why people sometimes don't have the education about how to properly manage their land is because that science is not always disseminated to the public. It's inaccessible. And that's a big part of what Wildlife Conscious is working to achieve. Did you want to add anything, Margaret? What am I missing here?
No, I think that's great. I guess I would just add that, so it is a new program. We've developed the criteria for certification, and we're hoping to get some farms certified this growing season. So we're starting it out as a pilot program in Humboldt County, and then we're hoping to expand it statewide in the next year.
Excellent. Yeah. And other certifications are another great conservation strategy to engage with. You know, you can get certified organic, you can get certified regenerative, and all of these certifications layered together is going to be really, really good for conservation on private lands with regards to cannabis. So I'd highly encourage you to check it out. We've got, I can put a link in the chat here, but it's up on our website, cannabisforconservation.org. You can look at the program draft, and if you'd like to get involved in the pilot program, please contact me or Margaret, and we can definitely get you guys involved. So Amanda is one of her farms is involved in our pilot program. We're very excited about that. So we will keep everyone updated on how that evolves. And Amanda, I'd love to turn it over to you now for a minute and let you talk about all the good things that you're doing in Southern Oregon.
Thank you, Jackie. As I said before, my name is Amanda Messler, the founder and president of Farms Inc., Oregon's Cannabis Farm Advocates. And I also chair the Josephine County Cannabis Advisory Panel, which is the local county where my farm is located as well. We are indoor, outdoor, and greenhouse. And our personal farm goal is to become a fully self-sustaining cannabis operation. I say that because we are a farm that happens to grow cannabis. We are not strictly a cannabis farm. We raise sheep, pigs, and chickens along with cut flowers and produce. But my husband and I are true city slickers, living in DC, New York, Boston, LA, and now settling on 10 acres in one of the best cannabis growing regions in the world. There is a level of unconnectedness one has with the land when living in the city. We bought our farm in 2015, and I would say it has taken me multiple years to break that and become more connected to our land. And it wasn't until I ran into Jackie in a forum similar to this that my eyes were open to conservation and farms. She and I have hit the ground running with the start of a conservation project in Oregon called Farms for Wild Pollinators. The goal is to replant up to 20% of your disturbed area with native pollinator plants. For example, our farm is 10 acres. We will plant around a total of 2 acres with native pollinators. But this is where it gets interesting. Where to plant and what to plant has always been the question. It became apparent that cannabis farms are going to have similar situations, meaning planting along a greenhouse, along a fence line. And I've always found that people want to do good things, but lack the guidance or the knowledge of what to do. This is where the idea of a guidebook came from. A guidebook of what to plant based on the common situations in a riparian zone, creeks or streams running through your property. Will irrigation be available? Do you want to focus on drought tolerant plants? So one of the goals of this conservation project is to supply the native plants to the farms complementary. And this is actually where it gets super cool. I've been having conversations with local pollinator and native plant groups in Oregon to collaborate on this project. The idea is that these groups would grow the plants for the farm, and Farms for Wild Pollinators would purchase them and distribute them to the farms. These pollinator and native plant groups would make money for their organizations, and a variety of natives would be cultivated, all coming full circle. We have run into some interesting hurdles, the word cannabis being the biggest one. We are finding some grant programs still are uneasy using federal money and funding anything with the word cannabis in it. So if you take cannabis out of the description of your project, then they ask what's special about the program. It happens to be on cannabis farms. This will continue to be a challenge on the search for grant money to fund the project. But that is where a nonprofit like Cannabis for Conservation comes in, and Jackie's willingness to fight to keep cannabis in the name is incredible. Things will eventually change, and if we are going to be pioneers in this, we're going to take a few hits in the beginning. And I wanted to leave you with one last cool thing that we're doing within the Farms for Wild Pollinator program. As we all know, the monarch butterfly population is in crisis. Monarchs only lay eggs on milkweed. And this is why we are creating the milkweed trail from Northern California to Southern Oregon. As this gets off the ground, the amount of data that we can pull from these cannabis farms is exponential, and how cool to have conservation research being done on cannabis farms. And like Jackie said, I am doing the pilot program for the wildlife certification as well here in Oregon to kind of get that kicked off the ground. Our pollinator program is just one of the categories that is through that wildlife certification program. And as I was reading through the criteria and marking myself, the way that it's set up is a 0, 1, 2, or 3 scale based on where you are in your level of those categories. Before doing anything, we're at, and 25 is what you need for the certification. And so before doing anything, we were at 19, which is great. And what we need to add for that additional, those numbers are nesting boxes for the songbirds and an additional bat species box, and to include some additional natives that we'll already be doing for the program. So we're to do a little pilot for me, and then I can spread it to the farms here in Oregon as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Amanda.
You're welcome. I also wanted to say that if you're interested in becoming a host farm for any of these programs, if you go to the Cannabis for Conservation website, that's where you can sign up and learn more about them. This doesn't just have to happen on the West Coast. Farms for Wild Pollinators can happen in any state to be planting natives for where you are cultivating cannabis. And it doesn't have to be outdoor. A lot of our indoor cultivators we're using as well to get some of those plants around that disturbed area, even if they're going to be in planter boxes as opposed to in the ground. That's really where that guidebook is going to come from. And those individual farms that we have here in Oregon that are starting this program with us all kind of have different areas in the county where they've been growing, and in Oregon that we'll be able to utilize them as the basis for what should be going into the guidebook.
Absolutely. I want to echo what Amanda just said right now, because I think this is a really important thing. Even if you are an indoor cultivator, arguably you have more of a responsibility then to create habitat around your space. Urban greening and urban green spaces are becoming increasingly important, and creating these islands of habitat in spaces where wildlife has kind of been extricated. It's really important that we do that. So yes, the guidebook that we're going to develop, we'll talk a lot about that. But if you want resources now, I am happy to provide lots of resources on native plants with regards to what state you're in, where you should plant them, how you should plant them. Just contact me, and I will happily relay that information. On the subject of conservation and people just kind of doing these things and doing these enhancements on their own, I'd like to invite everyone to just kind of discuss, what do you guys think the major impediments to conservation in this industry is? Is it financial? Is it lack of education? What do you guys see in each of your regions as being the main impediment?
I can go ahead and start. What we have found here is the lack of education. That's why we really need, we had all of these farms come and they're like, okay, what do I plant? And here are the resources for that, but we need to have some sort of a baseline. So it covers the 3 times, like fall, winter, and spring, to be having some of those things going on, different hedgerows along with pollinator plants and things of that sort. So, and it's interesting, as I reached out to some of our farmers, they're like, oh, we're already doing that. And then you get a list of what they're planting or what they're doing, and it's almost there, but then there's not really any natives involved in it. So it's kind of going to be taking a lot of that to the next level, because so many cultivators are doing so many amazing things. And these sorts of conservation programs really get to highlight them, where a lot of that goes unnoticed. What I found a lot is that people think of cannabis and they think of monocropping only. They don't know that people will put cover crops in and are actually being stewards of the land. And so it takes one by one, I say, to changing the idea of what a cannabis cultivator is and what they're doing on their property.
I definitely see financial as being one of those obstacles. People, there's a lot of front end costs, to getting in if you're newer. So I think that, some of that front end investment really does make some big differences in the long run for a sustainable farm grow operation. I think that we can never take for granted the resources that we have. So the use of some of the newer soils and the soil science, I think is really, really important for growers to get educated about. So it always comes full circle with education, but I am a huge proponent of the use of biosequestration and carbon sequestration in cannabis farming. And there's companies out there. One of them that I love working with is working on cannachar and using, some of the burnt trees to develop a proprietary blend of soils and fertilizers for farming. So the sky's the limit, really, with the integration of science into innovative and sustainable farming practices.
Yeah, absolutely. And, financial issues with conservation is a real thing. I mean, it's really interesting that it costs more to be green, or it costs more to be regenerative. And I think it costs more because it's just not the norm right now. And it needs to become the norm. And it also reflects, back to what I was talking about, it needs to be a change in our culture. So we need to value that more. When we value that more, there's going to be more funding available for practices like this. There's going to be perhaps even a market incentive for cannabis that's grown, using land management practices, or being regenerative, or sequestering carbon. And that's got to come from within. That's got to be an endogenous change in our culture. And part of Cannabis for Conservation's mission is to kind of change that paradigm. The regulatory framework just at the federal level for conserving special status species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act. It actually kind of encourages landowners to not want them there, because they have to go through all this paperwork. It can cost them money. They can get fined. So we need to work within the cannabis industry to set the standard for the national agricultural industry. And I believe that there's a great opportunity to do that here. It's not often we see an industry coming into regulation. And we've got a lot of opportunity to change this culture at a larger scale. And I just so believe in this industry to do that. And so I'm very proud to be part of it. And I think that cultivators genuinely want to be wildlife friendly, be sequestering carbon. But again, it comes back to that financial aspect. A lot of cultivators want to know what it's going to cost to just get involved. And sometimes that is a big impediment. And it's an inclusivity issue. Not every cultivator, especially a lot of our smaller regenerative farms here on the North Coast, they cannot possibly, with the taxes that are already in place, and with everything else that they've got to do, there's just no financial room to do more than they're already doing. And so, we are working to change that, and I hope that does change soon.
And you know what, Jackie, I would think too is that we came in Oregon as one of the first farms, first licensees to grow cannabis, and for the first year in 2016. And it's been that many years to try to get your business off the ground. So now that we've had that time to establish, and we know where buildings are going to stay and things of that sort, it's allowed us to focus on the conservation part, to know this is how the farm is going to be. These buildings are staying. What are we going to plant around it now? How can we bring that in? And I think those other states who are coming on now will over a few years, then we'll be able to focus more time on it. But I wish from the beginning I would have done some of my planning that way. But it works to come in at the end for it and then work around with what you already have. And that's why that guidebook's going to be great, because in Oregon, we have to have 6-foot tall fences around everything. So what does that look like for planting? What does that look like for wildlife moving through? Because that's one of our rules, something that other states don't have. So we're really focusing it on specific things to make it easier for people to just get started. And we even started for the pollinator program that if you want to just take some handful of, wild flower seeds and put that out in a patch just to get started, it's like your first introduction into it, and then the levels can go up.
Absolutely. Very good points, Amanda. There is a question here that I'd like to put to all the panelists. I'll let you guys answer it. It says, can you talk about the costs associated with some of these certifications? Have you seen consumers respond to certifications in such a way that justifies the expense for farmers? So I can start off unless someone else feels compelled to answer. No? Okay. So at least I'm not overly familiar with other certifications, the cost of other certifications to get involved with Wildlife Conscious. It is free to get involved in the pilot program. The only costs right now in the pilot program are the enhancements that need to be done to your farm. So it can vary. Some of those enhancements, like a bird box, can be anywhere from 50 to a couple $100. Some of the bat boxes, the bigger ones for pallet bats, those can be like $400 or $500. Some of the smaller ones for like little Myotis species, those can be like $80. So, and it just depends how much you already have going on your farm. In being a third-party certified certification, we cannot supply funding to pay for the inspectors to come out, because then that's not third-party certified. So the only cost to cultivators as far as Wildlife Conscious is the enhancements, and you have to pay your inspector to come out, which is normally a couple $100. And then we're also going to have an annual logo use fee, which will just go to sustain the program. So we actually are incorporating Wildlife Conscious as a 501c3 nonprofit, because we really don't want to take any additional money from this environmental space in the industry. So all the funding that we would get, we don't get anything from you pay the inspectors directly, which do not work for us. They're just trained and accredited for the program. And then the annual logo use fee will just go directly towards, a staff person to process applications. And then we'd also love to create a fund where we can get grants and we can offer funding for farms that want to get involved in the certification for their bat boxes, for their native plants. And we've had a lot of interest from native plant nurseries and other companies in providing a match. So if we can get $1,000, they'd match us $1,000 in native seeds or bird boxes or what have you. So yeah, I hope that answers that question. But does anyone else have something they'd like to add? Margaret?
Yeah, one thing that I'm really excited about is the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has just launched a cannabis restoration grants program. So we have grants that are specifically for cannabis. Right now, the one that we have out is aimed towards remediation, really, of illegal sites, of remediating those sites. But our next grant proposal that we're going to be putting out should be geared more towards actual cultivators and doing improvements on their land that are going to be beneficial for fish and wildlife. So there's a grant opportunity right there within California, which is exciting. And I think I'm interested in the second part of the question about how consumers are going to respond to certification. It's a very interesting question. I think that we don't really have enough information on that yet. And that's one of the things that we're hoping to figure out with the pilot program. The way that cannabis is, at least in California, there is some disconnect between the farms and between the distributors. So it'll be interesting to figure out how we can get the branding associated with the farm to the distributor so that customers know where their cannabis is coming from, how it's grown, that they'll see that logo and know that it's a wildlife conscious product. So that's one aspect that we still need to work on. But yeah, I think that I'm hopeful that we're going to figure that out. We also have a new program coming in California, which is appellation. So you have, areas of origin that are grown in specific ways, and then that's creates that appellation name. And one of the ways, though, that wildlife conscious can tie in with that is basically the way that a group of cultivators are cultivating can be in line with wildlife conscious, so they can sort of incorporate that into their appellation brand. So yeah, it'll be an interesting year figuring out how do we get from certification to consumers.
Margaret, we have Appalachia envy here in Oregon for what you guys are doing in California. I'm not going to lie. That is something that we are trying to work on here as well, especially for the Southern Oregon regions, for the terroir and where it's grown, and hopefully can use some of your models for what that is to propose to the legislature.
I really appreciate.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I really appreciate you bringing up the importance of branding so that we can work on more of a, farm to body campaign with cannabis consumers, because that has been, one of the goals with Tribal Hemp and Cannabis Magazine is we really envision our tribal cannabis cultivators as being the top shelf brands that are out there. And there was a couple of more questions in the chat box. And so I just wanted to share really briefly, the Indigenous Cannabis Coalition, I can see as one of those 501c3s that could definitely use, the support at www.indigenouscannabiscoalition.com. You can get free downloads of THC magazine digitally and just learn more about the work that we have going on. So to answer the Q&A chat questions, that's one of them that's out there, Indigenous Cannabis Coalition.
Absolutely. Support it. Send money now. So another organization is, of course, Cannabis for Conservation. You can donate directly on our website, and you can support us that way. We also are super open to in-kind donations. If you would like to purchase a bunch of native seeds and donate them, excellent. If you would like to purchase a bunch of outhouses and donate them, excellent. Anything to forward our conservation programs. Another program that we have is we're part of Patagonia's initiative 1% for the Planet. We're part of their nonprofit partner network. So any cultivator, any cannabis business that wants to become part of 1% for the Planet, you can then use the 1% for the Planet logo. And you can also use the Cannabis for Conservation logo. So in donating, you also kind of get a little bit of a market benefit there. Amanda is one of our cultivator members as part of 1% for the Planet, Bigsby Farms, which is super awesome. And then I'm not sure if there's any way, Margaret, is there any way that if people wanted to, I don't think they can support fish and wildlife in any particular way, but what ways could you see them kind of engaging with CDFW if they wanted to, assist with, providing grant money or what have you?
I don't know. Well, you can definitely contact us, especially because this is a new grant program. We're kind of figuring out how it works. So we have an email address that's specific for cannabis. It's askcannabis@wildlife.ca.gov. You're also welcome to email me directly. My email address is margaret.mantor@wildlife.ca.gov. Even if it's not donations to the grant program, we are connected with a lot of growers that need grants. So even if they're not getting a grant from us, we can connect you with them. And we also, just me specifically, I'm looking to connect with a lot of different growers, different people, to figure out how we can develop more education and outreach, to get that knowledge from the growers themselves in figuring out, how can we do things better? How can we connect? We're constantly developing rules and regulations. We're doing one right now for a new kind of lake and stream bed alteration agreement that's specific for cannabis cultivators. So if you're interested in those kinds of things as well, we put things out for public comment, but I'm also very open to having people contact me at any time to find out what we're doing and how you can be involved.
Jackie, I wanted to speak to one of the questions that was in the Q&A. They were asking about water conservation. There is another nonprofit called the Resource Innovation Institute, and they just published a cannabis water report, the first ever of its kind, with UC Berkeley as well, kind of debunking this is a thirsty plant, we're wasting water and things of that sort. They're also creating best practice guides when it comes to water conservation, along with energy conservation. So we are converting some of our greenhouses to go into indoor, and we've been benchmarking with them on that transition over for the energy and the water conservation part of it. So that cannabis water report, you can actually download from their website. It's a free download at the Resource Innovation Institute.
Thank you so much for commenting on that, Amanda. I definitely wanted to get to that question because water conservation is so important. Water is life, right? And so we need to really work in the industry to reduce our water consumption. And there's other measures too. I mean, any cannabis cultivation with regards to water conservation you can use pretty much any agricultural water reduction practices, such as mulching, such as live soil, such as water meters, overflow controls. There's lots of different ways that you can do that. And I know that there's a ton of resources out there on the internet, but if you want some specific ones, feel free to contact me, Jackie at cannabisforconservation.org, and I will happily pass those along. We do have a couple more questions from everybody that I think I would just really like to get to. Oh, geez, sorry, I'm scrolling too fast. So there's a question about scaling here. Let me see. I'm sorry, give me 1 second. What are some challenges to these programs scaling on a larger scale? What support do you need to have these topics and solutions scale at the rate of legalization? So does anyone want to take that one? No? Okay. It's an excellent question, really. Scaling is an issue. And one of the reasons that it does take a minute to scale these programs is some of the reasons that we talked about before, all these impediments to conservation, lack of resources, financial resources, lack of education, lack of the ability for the federal government grants to engage in this space. There's tons of federal conservation going on different types of agricultural lands. Farmers can literally get paid for creating habitat or maintaining habitat or farming in a specific way that's beneficial to a certain species. And that's just not available to cannabis cultivators. So part of scaling is going to be obviously more education, it's going to be more financial resources, and it's going to be a cultural change as well. So we do have a couple more questions here. Who is leading the discussion on cannabis and carbon? Do you foresee any labels, public-facing measures, or incentives for farms to reduce their carbon output? Do you think this could ever give better incentives for outdoor growers versus indoor growers? Anybody want to take that one?
I don't want to necessarily leading the conversation, but Native Health Matters out of Oklahoma is working on some earlier stages of the Indigenous Production Trade Alliance, where a huge portion of the research that they're looking to do in tribal colleges and universities is around carbon sequestration in cannabis, specifically in fiber. So there's a lot of networking, and I think it kind of goes to the scaling question that was just talked about earlier, is that there's a lot of the early infrastructure and the groundwork that needs to be laid. And then there was the COVID pandemic that kind of put a little bit of hiccup in the continuity. Some tribes that were originally planning to be a part were not able to plant seed because of the quarantines and things like that. And so it's really exciting to be a part of those conversations with a closed network, trade alliance, production, just specifically within tribal communities that are looking at some of the federal government carbon programs that are out there, so that they can find creative incentive ways to replicate the programs in other tribal communities. So they're kind of going to be those landmine communities.
Awesome. Thanks, Mary Jane. I'd love to talk about that a little bit more, but I think I want to make sure we get everyone's questions in. So we do have another question. Thank you for your important work and great presentations. Are any of you partnering with academic institutions to advance your efforts? Yeah, Cannabis for Conservation works with Humboldt State University. We work directly with the Wildlife Department there to help produce the Wildlife Conscious certification. We also work pretty extensively with UC Berkeley and the Cannabis Research Center. They've also been pretty integral to the Wildlife Conscious certification and a number of other programs that we're working on. So yeah, definitely. And we'd love to work with more. I'd love to get in Oregon and work with OSU on our Farms for Wild Pollinators program. Amanda and I have talked about that as well. Mary Jane, are you guys working with any academic institutions or no?
Yes, we're working with several tribal college and universities that are operating out there and aligning some of that research with some of the work and the foundation that was laid with the Indigenous Production Trade Alliance and Native Health Matters, which is specifically being done through Clemson University.
Excellent. Let me see. We have another question.
There's some questions in the chat, Jackie. They said if you want to open that box as well, besides the Q&A.
Oh, yes. Okay. There's a comment here just related to what Mary Jane said. There's a brand new program in the University of California Center for Climate Justice that aims to work with academics, private sector, and grassroots orgs and Indigenous groups. So excellent information there. And there's a link if people want to check that out a little bit more. Here's another question. So can sunlight be used in indoor facilities to reduce electric lighting and cooling loads? And then it says, read the white paper from CCV research. So at least on the in Northern California here, I know that no one's really doing sunlight with indoor. They're doing more greenhouse growing with sunlight, and then they're doing light deprivation. But I'm sure that there is some way that you could use sunlight to grow indoors. I mean, I guess if your definition of indoor is just kind of a hermetically sealed environment, there's plenty of greenhouses that do that. So I'm sure that there are ways to do that. And I think probably the Resource Innovation Institute has excellent resources for how to reduce your energy costs if you are an indoor cultivator. Anything else on that one?
They have excellent best practices guides for dehumidification, through cooling and everything else. So one by one, they've been putting those out after they've been through a very heavy peer review study, which is just incredible.
Absolutely. Check out the RII for sure. Sorry, guys, I'm toggling back and forth. And then we're probably going to have to jump off here soon just because it is getting closer to 11:15 and another panelist is going to have to come on. But is biofiltration something that can be utilized in this industry for recycling and cleaning water systems? I'm sure it could be used in this industry. I'm not an expert on biofiltration, but there are lots of unique and kind of up and coming different conservation methods. I'm sure that biofiltration will be one of them. I know that there's a lot of research now with like aquaponics and cannabis and seeing how you can do that. So obviously that involves a lot of biofiltration. I wish I could answer that question a little bit better, but I can try to do some research and get back to you. Does anyone else want to add on to that? Okay. And the last question, you mentioned California is offering grants. Do you think that the USDA and other federal groups will start supporting these programs when national legalization occurs? Oh, and we just got a note saying we could go over until 11:25. So we can definitely work to get some more of these questions answered. So does anyone want to talk about federal grants? No? Okay,
I can talk just a little bit about it, Jackie.
Go ahead.
So, I mean, we haven't heard anything really from the federal government, just working within the California government. But I think that the more voters are involved and making sure that they're following legislation, the more there's going to be change. That's what has caused the change in California. It's all driven by voters wanting cannabis to become legalized. And then basically everything that the Department of Fish and Wildlife does is driven through by legislation. So we're able to offer grants because it's something that voters wanted. So that's just a general recommendation, is make sure that you're following legislation and getting involved as much as you can.
I just want to piggyback off of that. The legislation and following it and being active in that is so important for our industry. My big fancy background is because what I use when I'm lobbying the legislature here in Oregon. And so I can't tell you how critical it is. I've spent the past year getting the farmer the seat at the table, because our land use attorney will say, if you aren't at the table, you're on the table, and you need to be at the table. And so now the farmers here in Oregon have a seat at every single table and have their voice heard that we've been working on, and it is critical. And so I cannot say enough that legislation that's happening in your states, when it comes to it, you need to be politically active in it. It's the only way you'll make change. You know, we were one of the first states to legalize, and we have some kind of erroneous rules and regulations when we thought the feds were going to be coming in, that now we slowly and systematically have to get changed. And some of you in the newly coming on states might be able to heed that off for some, and not be able to have to fight it off later. It's way easier to eliminate it from the beginning than to try to change it down the road.
Absolutely. Yeah. Obviously being politically active is really important. And also I think that if you are a farmer, just now engaging with the agencies that offer these grants at the federal level is really important, and saying, hey, when this becomes available, it'd be great if you guys can push for cultivators to be included when there's federal legalization. I know in Oregon, and I can't even talk. In Oregon, Farms for Wild Pollinators, the project that we're working on, we were interested in doing the Conservation Innovation Grant, which is funded by the USDA, US Department of Agriculture. And so they kind of give the states the authority to fund the grants, or to fund the different projects. So there's not a ton of oversight there. They give them a lot of leeway to fund what they want, but because cannabis is still a Schedule I drug at the federal level, they can't fund cannabis projects in the state. So it's important to engage with the federal agencies that are in your region, just in your state, and saying that that's what you want, and of course voting on it as well. But just opening that communication, doing that outreach, just being humans, talking, communicating, telling them what you want is really important, because they can fight for you too. Once it becomes federally legal. We do have another question here. What type of alliances for these types of conservation programs are being created between states that you're aware of? So between states, I don't know of any. Do any of you guys know of any?
I think we're probably starting at the most with California and Oregon as kind of the first one to pull, those two states together is what I think, yeah. Yeah, I would say so as well. I mean, I think that especially once we get interstate commerce programs, to go between states will probably, conservation programs that can function between states will probably become more popular. That's also probably tied to federal legalization at some level as well, so. And I was going to say probably what also the Cannabis Certification Council is working on is bringing us together through the states, just like today. Absolutely, absolutely. So I don't think we have any more questions. Was there anything else that someone wanted to share that they didn't get to share during this conversation? No, okay. Well, thank you all so much. I'm just going to close with this. When it comes to conservation and being an environmental warrior for this planet,
A lot of times there aren't going to be financial kickbacks. A lot of times there's not going to be programs, and you need to go out and just do it anyway. You know, the environmental fight is one that's been going on for a very long time. I encourage everyone to engage with it, and do the best that you can. You know, if everyone does a couple of little things, it makes a huge difference. So focus on your farm, focus on what your business can do, give what you can, and it will make a world of difference for this industry and for this planet. So I so appreciate everyone that has participated in this panel. Amanda, Mary Jane, Margaret, thank you all so much. It's been a total honor being on this panel with you guys. Thank you to the Cannabis Certification Council for hosting us, and it's just been a real pleasure. If anyone wants to contact us, we can post our contact information in the chat after this, and feel free to reach out. So have a wonderful rest of your day. Enjoy the symposium. Take care, everyone.